If you want to support these projects, head over to mulliganbrothers.com, where you can now buy the Inspire Change t-shirts and much, much more. And please consider becoming a YouTube member with the join button down below. Before that, let's jump into the highlights.
Is there a time period for grief? Like, I feel like after 5 or 6 years, for me, I can sometimes be back on day one. Whereas, like, the time between those the grief, like you say, waves, they are definitely getting further and further apart. But do we need to completely eradicate going back to that day one?
People will often talk about moving on. They think, okay, once you're done grieving, there's this magic timeline of, okay, don't make any major life decisions for 1 year and then sort of you're done grieving. But that's not true at all. In fact, I have a lot of people that would come in my therapy office maybe 5 years after a big loss and wondering why they didn't feel better. And that was because they bought into that notion that time heals all wounds. Time actually doesn't heal anything. If you just sit around waiting for time to magically cause you to feel better, you won't. You have to take some positive action. You have to be proactive about healing your wounds if you actually want to feel better. That's tough to do because there are these expectations that if you love somebody, you'll grieve for maybe a year, maybe 3 years, depending on how deep your sorrow was. That's the equivalent of how much you love that person. Or sometimes there's the expectation that you should have moved on, or that your life isn't so bad anymore, so why aren't you happier? And when we put a timeline on it, or we have expectations, it often makes things worse, because then we think I should feel better, or maybe we think I shouldn't feel as happy as I do. But the truth is, grief is a process that we work through. I don't like to say that we move on, because for most of us, that loss is always going to be there. And we experience it differently from year to year. Maybe 10 years later, maybe 20 years later, an event happens, you go to a wedding, you have another child, something comes up, you graduate from something. And in those moments, the loss that you experience becomes sort of different. You think, oh, if only this person was here now. So I think it's just so important to not put a timeline on how long you should be grieving, and to know for the rest of your life, there may be moments that it hits you, and it might hit you differently than it did 10 or 20 years ago. But maybe you're in the grocery store and you see something that reminds you of your loved one, or somebody brings something up, or you meet somebody that reminds you of a loved one. It can stir up all sorts of feelings again. Maybe you thought you were done grieving, but the truth is, I don't think we're ever really done.
Yeah, and there's a thing I worry about for some people, and that's the burying of it. So just completely suppressing the feelings. One, like, what does that do? But also, how do we decide to embrace the pain and like start to feel grief?
There is a tendency to try to push it down, to ignore it, to suppress it, to pretend that pain doesn't exist. But it will come up one way or another. So sometimes when people ignore their sadness for years, it comes out as anger in all the wrong moments, that they have road rage, or they get really upset with somebody because they've worked so hard to push their grief down as much as they can, but it's not going to stay there. It's going to come out at times. So we have to let ourselves feel all of those emotions. And that's not to say that you want to stay stuck in a place of pain, but you want to make sure that you allow yourself to feel it enough so that you can start to heal. So if your sadness helps you honor your loss, then embrace it for a little bit. If you're so sad you can't get out of the house, you can't get out of bed, obviously then it's a problem. And you need to do something different. And doing something different could range from talking to people to finding coping strategies. But there's an exercise I do with people that talks about figuring out, are your emotions right now a friend or an enemy? So anger might give you energy to create change in life in some circumstances, but in other circumstances, your anger might cause you to say things you don't mean, and you might hurt people around you. So when it's a friend, embrace those tough emotions. When it's an enemy, then you need to figure out, how do I cope with my emotions in a way that helps me shift my emotional state, or calm down enough, or reduce the intensity enough that I can then think clearly and make a better decision. And when we're grieving, it's that whole jumble of emotions that get stirred up. It's tough to deal with. And while you certainly don't want to just stay stuck in a place of pain, you also don't want to distract yourself, or you don't want to try to avoid it by busying yourself with lots of things in your life, or pretending it doesn't exist, because that won't help you either. You need to work through those emotions. And part of that sometimes is just sitting and allowing yourself to feel sad. Maybe you write in a journal. Maybe you come up with 3 strategies that help you honor your loved one, like creating a picture collage, or maybe write them a letter, or you talk to somebody about your loved one, even though it's hard to do.
For me, whenever the grief comes up, like I let go, like I really do. I cry quite a lot, and I feel it really cathartic for me. Like it feels like it does something for me for sure. How does somebody who has buried it or who is stuck become unstuck? Like, is it something that people stay stuck? Does that? I mean, do you see people that who have been stuck for like 10 years?
I see a lot of people who've been stuck for years, sometimes decades, and they can't talk about it. They still can't talk about the person that they lost. They can't talk about their experience because it's too painful. And so they go to such great lengths trying to avoid anything that reminds them of the tough things that it starts to affect their life, that they can't go to certain places, or they can't eat certain foods. They can't talk to certain people because it reminds them of the pain. And that's a definite sign that they haven't dealt with it, that they're still putting in all of their energy and effort in trying to avoid it rather than work through it. And it will crop up at weird times, certain things. Their emotions will be out of proportion to what they're experiencing. They might get really sad about a movie that they're watching, but really the sadness is because it's lurking because they haven't dealt with their pain yet. Or they get really angry over little things. Well, it's because they haven't dealt with the anger that they feel that this happened. So our emotions are going to come out one way or another, and if we don't find healthy outlets like talking about it, journaling, reading, figuring out how do you meditate, how do you do yoga, going to therapy, all of those things help. But if we don't do any of those healthy things, then we often develop some pretty unhealthy coping strategies that keep us stuck, that give us maybe momentary pleasure, like eating too much or drinking too much. But then in the end, it creates a lot of bigger problems in our lives.
Yeah, so what are some of the ways that you'll see typically people manifest who aren't dealing with grief or dealing with a situation? How does it manifest in an average person's life?
So people who don't deal with grief tend to develop some pretty unhealthy habits. That might include anything from a phone addiction, because that's a great distraction. Whenever you're sad, whenever you're lonely, maybe they're just constantly scrolling through social media or always texting people, talking to everyone they can just to avoid the uncomfortable thoughts in their heads. When people don't deal with grief, they also usually struggle to sleep because that's the only time of day maybe that it's quiet and their brains are trying to work through things that they haven't addressed yet. So I'll see people that will sleep with the TV on, people that sleep with radio. They need constant noise around them because they're scared to be alone with their thoughts. And then during the day, a lot of times people need that too, that they can't sit in silence or be by themselves for a few minutes because it's too scary, it's too uncomfortable. At other times, people, again, they turn to food. They might eat too much to try to stuff their feelings, literally stuff them. Other people might drink too much because it temporarily numbs the pain. Other people tend to turn to drugs. Sometimes people even turn to what looks like a really healthy habit on the outside. So it might be that they turn to fitness and then they start working out almost constantly, every spare second that they have. And from the outside, people might think, wow, that person's really self-disciplined. But on the inside, the person might be in a lot of pain, and that just serves as a wonderful distraction from the pain because they always feel like they're doing something rather than dealing with their emotional pain. It's almost like they're putting their bodies through these physical trials and tests as a way to prove that they're good enough, that they're worthy enough, that they're able to still function in a almost social acceptable way to do it. So almost anything can become an unhealthy coping skill if we do it to excess, and it keeps us from avoiding the pain in the long term.
Okay, so many of the things you've just said I've definitely used in the past as well as coping strategies, but I also feel like I've embraced the pain as well. So how do you know? How do you know if you're, and can you do them like in side by side? Like, can you, I'm guessing it's a process of working along for over a period of time.
Right. When we turn to a coping strategy, we want to make sure that we're using it as a way to reduce the intensity of an uncomfortable emotion, or that we're using it to reduce the duration of it rather than just escape it altogether. So an example of a healthy coping strategy, it could be, say, watching TV. If you're really upset after a long day and you spend 30 minutes watching a TV show just as a way to say, okay, I need to calm down, I need this distraction for a few minutes, it can be a really healthy thing. When the TV show's over, you then might feel a little bit better, and then you can start to say, okay, how do I solve this problem, or what do I do about it? And then it's healthy. On the other hand, you might end up watching so much TV you binge watch TV for 3 days straight so that you don't have to deal with a problem. Well, then that coping strategy becomes unhealthy. And it's important to always ask ourselves, do I need to change the problem, or do I need to change how I feel about the problem? Some problems we can tackle. Maybe we're behind on our bills. You can sit down and you can tackle that issue. But when you lose somebody, you can't make them come back. So then you think, okay, how do I deal with how I feel about the problem? Maybe it's about reminding yourself of certain things, engaging in certain coping strategies. Maybe it's about, okay, how do I take care of myself? I'm going to go for a walk. Just figuring out how do I manage my emotional state? You can't fix it, but there are certain things you can do to fix how you feel about it.
If you enjoyed the video, please consider going to mulliganbrothers.com, where you can now buy the new Inspire Change t-shirts, the LFG t-shirts, the Hardest Worker in the Room t-shirts. Everybody who's been supporting us has made this project possible, and projects like this in the future possible. We cannot fly all around the world with our film crew and ourselves and do these interviews and documentaries without your support. So thank you very much. The support has been amazing and we appreciate it. Also, there is a join button down below where you can consider becoming a YouTube member of this channel by hitting that join button. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to follow us on the behind the scenes stuff of our editor, at Niamh Mulligan, X on Instagram, or at Jordan Mulligan Brother for myself on Instagram as well, you can see what we get up to on a day-to-day basis. Thank you for watching. Have a blessed and productive day. Go inspire some change, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.